from the flight deck. This is the Plane Jockeys podcast, where we dig into some of the stories and personalities you've seen on Airline Videos live. Our estimated time en route is, well, however long these guys want to chat. Now sit back and relax and enjoy the show. It's a lot more fun than reading the safety card. I promise.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Airline Videos Live Plane Jockeys podcast. I am Plane Jockey Kevin. Well, I have taken the show on the road this week back to Phoenix, Arizona. Maybe you've been watching the Weather Channel lately and seeing all these massive monsoon storms hitting the Phoenix and Arizona area. Well, what kind of chaos does this bring on to the flight operations with airlines flying in and out of Phoenix? Well, no better person to tell us how this affects the airline than executive producer Brad Ward here on Airline Videos Live. Brad, welcome to the podcast.
Aloha, y'all. So everyone may have seen that the weather in the Southwest this year especially has just been pretty dicey. And based on some conversations that we had with some viewers and from SkyOps Live there in Phoenix, I had this idea like, hey, maybe we should actually talk about how this weather affects airline operations and more importantly, how it could affect you if you're a passenger on one of these flights going to an airport like Phoenix or Tucson or Albuquerque or even Denver.
Yeah.
I think the first thing that we could just get out of the way is for those of you who may be wondering, who is this Brad guy? I've heard him being called an EP before. And like he's always on the stream and he's always talking and he always says aloha. So what's his scoop? I have been working as an aircraft dispatcher for airlines for 22 years now. I'm on my third airline and probably last. And it's a major airline here in the United States. And we have a pretty significant operation in the desert Southwest. And so dealing with the monsoon is a pretty much an everyday thing for us in the summertime. And then the next question that people might be asking is, what on earth is a monsoon? I thought a monsoon was something in India that causes heaps of flooding and things like that. The monsoon in the desert Southwest is really a very unique weather event that tends to happen every single summer. And what it is you have a high pressure system or an area of high pressure that develops over, say, Utah and Colorado. And what that does is if you think of the air circulating around a high pressure system, it tends to draw this moist tropical air down from Mexico, where the water in, say, the Gulf of California and the Pacific Ocean down off the coast of Mexico is very warm. And so it's bringing this warm, moist air up into the desert Southwest. And so, you know, some of the ingredients you need for thunderstorms are instability and moisture and lift. And you can imagine with the heat, you get lots of lift. The high pressure system has drawn all this moisture up from Mexico. And so you just need a little spark, a little instability, and lo and behold, you get some pretty good thunderstorms. So that's the what tends to happen. And it seems to happen almost every day, if not every day, especially this year.
Yeah.
And especially across Arizona and New Mexico and parts of southern Utah. So the thing that I think people also might be wondering is the monsoon thunderstorm any different than, say, your average thunderstorm that somebody in the Midwest and the East Coast would see? And the answer is yes, mainly for two reasons. Number one is the threats that come from those thunderstorms. And number two is you can sort of predict where they're going to develop and where they're going to go, but they are much less predictable in terms of where they pop up and where they move than, say, your average Midwest and East Coast thunderstorm. And of course, that provides an extra layer of difficulty from an airline perspective because we can only do so much planning. And the question is, how much planning, how much do you take into account the possibility of this happening? Because as we'll get into, you have questions about fuel and you have questions about routing. And all of these are, not only are they costs, but they are you run into limitations of the aircraft, and so it adds to this balancing game that you don't necessarily have in other parts of the country that is really interesting to contend with.
Interesting.
I think what we'll do first is kind of take a step back and think, let's imagine we're all sitting in an operations center for an airline like American or Southwest. And the reason why I picked those two is because they are the ones that have hubs in Phoenix. And as you can imagine, when you have a hub in an area that has weather issues, and particularly sort of cantankerous weather that is difficult to predict, you can imagine that it adds that dynamic of uncertainty to your operation. Because in a hub situation, you have all of these people that are coming to your airport, and most of them are actually going to get on another flight and go somewhere else.
Right.
And when the weather's fine, that works perfectly. But when the weather's not so good, you run into all sorts of issues. And I'll just talk about some of the issues you might run into. So let's just say, for the sake of example, that a thunderstorm rolls over the Phoenix airport and ends up sitting there and for 30-40 minutes, and you cannot have any departures or arrivals. Well, that's a good question, right? Because that's actually the first question that a dispatcher is going to be asking. So generally, those flights are heading towards Phoenix, and they most likely will already have an alternate airport listed on their paperwork.
Okay.
And that's because the dispatchers have essentially been trained. Hey, it's the summertime. Hey, it's monsoon season. And hey, look, this forecast that we used to actually dispatch the aircraft from a particular airport, let's say Chicago, to Phoenix, that forecast indicates that there's a chance of thunderstorms in the Phoenix area. So pretty much nobody is going to choose to roll into that airport without an alternate airport in their back pocket and the fuel on the airplane to go to that alternate airport. The question then becomes, and this happens quite often, what happens, say, Tucson? That's your closest legitimate option, because Williams Gateway is sometimes going to have the same weather issues that the Phoenix airport has, because they're only 20 miles apart. That Tucson may be your closest real option, but it's not uncommon for Tucson to have a problem at the same time Phoenix does.
Right.
And for anybody that's not been to Arizona, this is not like the East Coast where you just go another 50 miles and you've got another like relatively large airport with lots of facilities where you can land and pull up to a gate and get fuel and everybody will be happy. There are some long stretches
right.
of nothingness. And so your next option after that is Yuma. But the question about Yuma is do you want to send your people that came from Chicago to Yuma, Arizona? And what happens if the crew is short on duty time? What happens if they time out in Yuma? Suddenly you have an airplane, 100 and something people, and a crew all in Yuma, Arizona, where you're trying to find hotels and things like that for them.
Yeah.
So then the next option becomes Las Vegas. And again, not totally uncommon for Vegas and Phoenix to have issues at the same time. But that's probably your closest real legitimate alternate. And then from there, after that, you're looking at, say, Albuquerque or the Los Angeles basin. Now, yeah, that's a long way. And if you have a 55 minutes to an hour of flight time to get from your destination, which would be Phoenix, to your alternate, which would, say, be Ontario or LAX, you've got to carry the fuel for that.
Right.
And we'll kind of get into the fuel implications when we talk about the second part. But what I wanted to just sort of bring to mind here is that conversation, that line of thinking in a hub situation could easily be happening to anywhere between 5 and 50 airplanes at the exact same time.
Wow.
And so suddenly everybody is in demand for information, and the relatively quiet scene in the airline operations center can just go to absolute utter mayhem very, very quickly because everybody is suddenly swamped trying to get this information out to the crews and to figure out where everybody is going to go if they don't have the fuel to wait it out. So this is just sort of an initial, the initial thinking, not even flight specific thinking, but initial thinking that goes on to these situations when you have a hub shut down. And it can even happen if a thunderstorm isn't even on the field, even if the thunderstorm is just near the field. Because I was getting at to before, the threats are different in these weather situations. Mm-hmm. On the East Coast, it's could be lightning, heavy rain, microbursts, wind shear, things like that, and that can all happen in a monsoon storm. But the monsoon storms, because of their location and because of the way that they generally develop, they can actually some of the risks become heightened in these situations. Wind shear and microbursts are huge threats to aircraft in these monsoon storms. And then the other part that you just don't see in other parts of the country is the good old fashioned haboob. And yes. that's a dust storm, in, as we would call it. And the dust storm, it rolls over an airport and it's going to bring very low visibility and just mayhem. It's very difficult to be outside, as I'm sure you know from your experiences living there.
Yes.
It is not a pleasant situation, and the dust plus airplanes don't equal good things generally.
Right.
It's not that it's unsafe to take off or land in a dust storm. You don't really want to make a habit out of it or a practice out of it. But you run into the situation where you could increase the chances of the aircraft needing an inspection after it's had a dust encounter like that. But anyway, the bottom line is that these monsoon storms in the desert, and especially with, like I said, with the dust, with the wind shear, with the wind gusts, with the lightning, you get near constant lightning with a lot of these monsoon storms. And so what it does is it really heightens some of these threats, these weather threats that are maybe more prominent in a monsoon thunderstorm than they would be in, say, your garden variety thunderstorm in the Midwest or the East Coast.
So I would assume that, the summer months are some of the most challenging for you guys as flight operations.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. We also sort of just trade busyness because you can trade the thunderstorms and the monsoons of the summer season with ice storms and snowstorms in the winter season.
Right.
And I would say the big difference there is that other than dicey runway conditions and making sure that the airplanes are de-iced suitably, generally you don't have the same aircraft specific threats in a winter situation that you do in the summer. The winter meltdowns are generally because of not being able to de-ice aircraft because the snow's coming down too heavily, right, or there's some sort of frozen precipitation that just you literally can't de-ice the airplane fast enough. Those sort of ground-based operational problems are normally what you see in the wintertime. The summertime it can be quite a bit different because that's when you get these situations where an airport will get a microburst alert,
right,
and everybody is forced to go holding. And then I think this is the other takeaway I would take from this whole thing is I'm sort of speaking nonchalantly about some of these risks and threats, and I just want to make sure that everybody knows that the reason why we speak of them like we do is because we take the safety aspect of this for granted. Mm-hmm. Like nobody is going to land in a really nasty thunderstorm over the Phoenix airport. It's just not going to happen. And in fact, I was listening to air traffic control the other day when we had one move over the field, and you could listen to the interactions between the controllers and the pilots, and those pilots that were there on the ground waiting to depart none of them were interested in taking off into a nasty thunderstorm.
Right.
So I want to make sure that everybody is aware of the fact that like the safety posture of the way that we operate in commercial aviation is just the default. And so we can sort of talk easily about these risks and threats because the chances of them actually impacting a specific flight, with all of the warning systems we have on airplanes, with the weather we have on the airplane, with the interaction between the pilots and the dispatchers and the pilots and the controllers, and this the whole system as it is, we basically have it set up to prevent as much as possible the situation where an aircraft is going into an unsafe situation. So that's the other thing I want to make sure people take away from this is it's easy for me to say, like, oh yeah, there's microbursts and lightning and blah blah blah, and the chances of you as a passenger being in those conditions on an airplane are extraordinarily slim because of the way that of the system we have set up. Let's put it that way. And that's what causes all the problems, honestly. If we could just fly through all this, we wouldn't be having this conversation about where our flights are going to go and things like that when they can't get in, right? Because they would all get in. So like I said, the safety is the default, the safety perspective.
Brad, that is some fascinating stuff. And we're going to learn more about these monsoon storms here in Phoenix, Arizona, right after the break. Don't go anywhere. More on the Plane Jockeys podcast.
Folks, again from the flight deck, we hope you're enjoying those luxurious seats and plentiful complimentary beverages. Oh, right, it's a podcast. Well, then we hope you're enjoying the banter. Stay tuned for more.
Oh, yes, there's always more to the story. Isn't that right, Mr. EP?
Well, there's always more.
Well, let's say, Brad, that I am on a plane, maybe American, from Chicago to Phoenix and enjoying my nice flight. Maybe we're over Kansas City, Missouri. And, there was always a thought of maybe possibly it was going to be stormy in Phoenix before we left Chicago. But the storms, they're brewing all of a sudden while we're over Kansas City. What exactly is going on behind the scenes?
Yeah. Okay. So let's drill down to like a flight specific situation like this. And this is all really timely, not just because of the monsoon, but because I had a situation much like this a couple of days ago at work. And so this is really fresh in my mind right now. Okay. So the flight crew is either looking at their iPad where they can get some rudimentary weather radar image pictures from down the road, kind of like what you can see on the internet. Maybe not quite as precise because generally it has a lot of other aviation weather. It has to go into those products too. So they can see something's going up there in Arizona, or let's say they get a heads up from the dispatcher because I'm sitting there watching this weather and watching the thunderstorms start to pop up. And I can let my crews know like early out. And this is a conversation that we'll normally have over ACARS, which is an acronym for our text messaging system. So I can send them a text message, they can send me text messages, and we can end up having conversations for hours over these systems, just with updating them with information and giving them different ideas and bouncing things back and forth. So that's generally how we converse. So, but just in case people are wondering, the other ways that we can talk to them from our operations centers, we can use satellite phones. Normally, most airlines have satellite phones installed on the airplane. And then we can also use ground-based radios, just like ATC does, just on different frequencies, so that we're not talking on the same frequencies that the controllers are using. So we have all sorts of different ways that we can talk to these flights in the air. But let's just say that the crew does see or is notified that, hey, some of these storms are starting to go up over Arizona and starting to be an issue. So the first question as a dispatcher that I'm going to be asking myself is the arrival path into Phoenix going to work? based on where that weather is growing. And do I need to try to change that? There's really two ways of looking at this. Number one is I could try to change that myself if it looks like the arrival path that we're taking is going to be covered with thunderstorms.
Mm-hmm.
But also, air traffic control is normally really proactive at busy airports in forcing airplanes off of one particular arrival path and onto another.
Okay.
And they'll do the same thing with departures. They'll close one departure route and open departure routes. And I guess maybe I should just pause here really quickly, because somebody is going to be like, path, and like, it's an airplane. Why can't you just go from point A to point B?
Mm-hmm.
Well, as you can imagine, with all of the traffic out there, you can't just take off from an airport, point at the next airport, and land. You have to fit into the flow of what the air traffic controllers are able to handle.
Mm-hmm.
So generally, going into a really busy airport like Phoenix, you're going to have 5, 6, 7 different arrival paths around a 360-degree circle
mm-hmm.
that you can take into an airport, and you might have the same number of departure paths, and you normally have to take one of these paths in and out, because that's the way that the controllers will know where you're going to be and how your aircraft is going to interact with everybody else. So when we pick those arrival paths and departure paths, when we file the flight plan initially with air traffic control, but those can always be changed in the air. And in this situation where your flight's over Kansas City, me as a dispatcher, I might be thinking either do I want to change the arrival path because this one is not going to work out, or are the thunderstorms, just kind of sporadic and sparse enough that the airplane will be able to move around it without move around them without too many problems.
Mm-hmm.
Or do I want to wait and see if air traffic control is going to move them? Because I can look at all of the flights going into Phoenix, and I can see that they're already starting to move some of the flights closer to Phoenix. And so in the back of my mind, I'm thinking my flight's going to be moved too by air traffic control, and I don't even need to do anything to have the crew ask to change it themselves. Because this is the other part of that conversation back and forth between the dispatcher and the flight crew, is that when a route is changed en route by the pilots or by the dispatcher, normally that conversation goes something like this. Dispatcher tells the flight crew, hey, here's a different route that I would have you ask for. And the flight crew will ask the air traffic controller for that route. The air traffic controller will go and do what they need to do with that route to make sure that, say, the air traffic control centers further down the road are okay with it. And then they'll come back to the flight crew and say, yes, you can fly on this new route. Off you go.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sort of out of that loop when that happens. And I'm more interested in making sure that the routing that goes up to the crew is what I and what they would like to do.
Right.
And then they sort of handle those specifics with the air traffic controllers. So, but it's generally easier for the ATC system if you know that they're going to change the routings anyway, to let them do it. But you can sort of predict that that's going to happen. And now, if you think to yourself, I'm going to be flying a longer flight into Phoenix, what are the implications here? Well, the number one implication is fuel. Mm-hmm. And so you need to run calculations as a dispatcher to make sure that the aircraft has the fuel to fly that longer route onto that new arrival path. And so as a dispatcher, I'm running that calculation in the flight planning system. I'm getting some numbers back from it. I'm running some calculations. Okay, this is how much fuel they have. This is how much it's going to take. Great, they've got enough. And then I send that information to the crew so that they know, hey, chances are air traffic control is going to change your route, and this is how much fuel it will take when they do that. So we're trying to think ahead of the situations, because when they start holding and they start working around thunderstorms and they start kind of getting bumped around a little bit because they're flying near this weather, that's not really the time to be, right. Talking back and forth as much as you can, because they're busy, and as a dispatcher, you're always sort of thinking in the back of your mind, like, where is the crew right now?
Mhm.
Are they busy aviating the aircraft safely, or might they be in a situation where we can have a chat about routings and alternate airports and things like that? Suffice to say that that's going to be the first part of this whole equation. Is my route going to change getting to the airport? And then the second part of that is, do I need to change my alternate airport? Because I'm watching those alternate airports let's say maybe I did have Tucson listed. Now I'm watching Tucson closely to see if thunderstorms are going to impact the airport there. If not, I need to take some of the additional fuel I have on the plane, because I'm going to carry additional fuel from Chicago, because I knew these thunderstorms were going to pop up, or I had a really good idea they were going to pop up. And I know that that getting around them is going to take more fuel, whether it's a different arrival path, whether it's just moving around them. I know that I might need to change my alternate airport. So I'm just going to carry additional fuel on the airplane to be able to do that. And so now I'm starting to think about fuel calculations, and I'm thinking about, what is the fuel burn going to be to go to Las Vegas instead of going to Tucson? And then I'm thinking about, if I'm on this new arrival path and it's approaching Phoenix from the southeast instead of the northeast, like it would be if I'm coming from Chicago, am I going to be able to is my flight going to be able to get to Las Vegas if the thunderstorms are in between my plane and Las Vegas? And then so if I can't get to Las Vegas, or it's going to be very difficult and circuitous to get to Las Vegas, is there another place I can go? So these are all, like I said, all the kinds of the questions that are going through the back of your mind. And from the time that this weather starts developing till the time the airplane gets on the ground, there's this constant cycling of questions going through your mind, and trying to account for these potential situations before they arise.
And I was going to say, I mean, you could sit there and say, all right, this is the new plan. This is the new plan. But I mean, that could change within the next 5 minutes, and then you got to find the next plan, right?
You always have to hold your plans loosely.
Yeah.
In this industry. And in fact, what I would say is the smartest thing that you can do as a dispatcher is to have multiple plans that will all work. Or when one does, that will all work initially, and then when this one stops working for one reason and this one stops working for that reason, that you still had in the back of your mind an out. You always want to have an out. Like that's sort of rule one of flight dispatch into situations where there may be weather issues or airport constraints and things like that. Like you always want to have the ability to go somewhere else, do something else, and so that's having that in the back of your mind from the get-go, and then reiterating that a lot when the plane is in the air is just something that you just get used to doing. And let me be clear, no dispatcher only has one flight in the air at a time. We all have anywhere between 5 and 25 flights in the air at the same time.
Oh my gosh.
And if they're all going to an airport like this, this is going on multiple times. And so you can imagine, this is why this job gets very, very busy very quickly, because you're going through this repeatedly with multiple flights at the same time.
I'm stressed out just listening to this. How do you deal with that stress?
I mean, honestly, there's a fulfillment when your plans work, and you go home at the end of the night or the end of the day, and everybody is well, and they may not even be where they want to be, but you know that you helped this system operate to where it happened safely, and it happened maybe as efficiently as possible, but certainly as safely as possible, and as comfortably as possible for the passengers, and everybody as well. That's actually a pretty good feeling. And it's even better feeling when your plan works to the point that you can sort of get to your destination, and that you can actually their flight ends, you would say, successfully, in that you actually did get into Phoenix because you had the fuel to wait out the thunderstorms, or you had a route that worked out really well to work around them. There's a lot of satisfaction that comes from that, and it can happen every day in the summertime. So it balances out between the stress and the satisfaction. And I think that's what it is for a lot of jobs. And there definitely is a satisfaction in knowing that you helped safety and you helped people get to where they need to go despite these challenging circumstances.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing. Amazing to hear.
So the only other thing I wanted to mention here real quick too, that I didn't really get into, I think a lot of people think that you can just have an airplane at the gate, you can fill it up full of people, you can fill it up full of cargo, you can fill the gas tanks until the stopper stops on the pump, like it does with your car,
right?
And just go. But that's not accurate. Every aircraft has a maximum takeoff weight and a maximum landing weight, and there are other sort of restrictive weights too. But let's just, for the sake of what we're doing here, those are the two most important weights: your maximum takeoff weight and your maximum landing weight. There's also the question of, even at that structural maximum takeoff weight, are the conditions at the airport and on the runway that you're going to be using such that you can actually take off at that weight? Or is it really, really hot, like in Phoenix, or Denver is where this is a common thing, where, because you've got elevation in the mix now too, where the aircraft performance is maybe requires a longer runway than you actually have. And when that happens, your only thing you have left is to reduce the weight so that you can safely take off, and off you go. And the same works for landing, although normally landing is a lot less restrictive than taking off. And so for our flight leaving Chicago, I can't just fill up the tanks and give them the equivalent of 3 or 4 hours of fuel to mess around,
right?
Because I have a maximum structural landing weight that I can't exceed landing in Phoenix. And so there's a balance in here too that's also really interesting, because between that maximum takeoff weight and maximum landing weight is a certain amount of weight you have available, right? And in that weight, you need to carry fuel, you need to carry your passengers, and you need to carry your cargo. And if you think of it like a pie chart, you can make one piece of the pie bigger, which would be the fuel, but you're squeezing the other parts of the pie.
Right.
And so the reason I'm bringing this up is that you might hear in some situations, oh, hey, we're looking for volunteers, and 10 people volunteer, and you get on an airplane and there's still empty seats. Well, it wasn't because those 10 people just didn't fit. It's because the flight actually had to go out a little bit empty in order to have the fuel to complete what it's trying to do.
Right.
And so where this becomes a really big issue for us as dispatchers is we have to balance that out every day. Can I carry this full load between Chicago and Phoenix and still have the fuel that we need? Not only the fuel that we need to accomplish the flight legally, but the fuel that we want to give ourselves some of that flexibility to be able to change our plans en route. And let's just say in this theoretical situation, you've got a lot of people trying to get from Chicago to Phoenix on your airplane. You're up against your landing weight in Phoenix. You want a lot of fuel, but you also want to try to get as many of these folks there as possible.
Right.
Maybe you just live with the possibility that Tucson is a safe and legal alternate airport, and it's the closest one I have available, so I'm going to use that. And you are sort of taking into account the possibility that somewhere along the way, the forecasts that we use for the airports, that's going to make Tucson not legal as an alternate airport. There are legality issues there. And you don't have the fuel to go to another airport. Well, that's again where safety takes front and center, because then at that point, you as the dispatcher are telling the crew, you know what, your Tucson alternate is not legal. In Phoenix, we've got these thunderstorms building up. I don't feel comfortable with you going to Phoenix without an alternate, even if it is legal. And so we need to stop for gas. And so that's when you'll see a plane stop and say Denver or Albuquerque, and far away from what the intended destination, right, because they needed to pick up some fuel. So that balance between the fuel and your payload, I hate to refer to people as payload, but I'm just trying to take everything into account of that between passengers and freight. It's not a situation where you can just throw everything on and go. That's part of the balance, and that you have to take into account with every flight in these situations. Right. And that adds a whole different dynamic.
Oh, yes.
That I just thought people might find interesting.
Oh, yes. I mean, I'm, talking to Stig about the maintenance. Now you at the flight operations. It's amazing about all just the things that are going on behind the scenes to make the flights happen. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it happens every day, hundreds of times a day, thousands of times a day at airlines all across the country. And I think personally that the way the system we have of operational control between pilots and dispatchers, and especially in these situations where weather is getting dicey, that's why this industry is so safe, is because we have these systems in place to make sure that the safest thing happens every single time. And next time, or some other time down the road, we can get into some of the other facets of dispatching, and I think people might find interesting.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Brad, Mr. EP of Airline Videos Live, this has been very interesting to learn about what's going on behind the scenes during these monsoon storms in Arizona. Thanks so much for coming on to the Plane Jockeys podcast here today.
Yeah, thanks for letting me ramble on, and hopefully this has been enlightening for some folks.
Absolutely. We'll catch you next time on the next Plane Jockeys podcast. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Well, folks, we finally made it. That's good, because the first officer and I have talked so much, I feel like I know him better than my brother.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Plane Jockeys podcast, a companion to Airline Videos Live.
Goodbye.
Find us on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Airline Videos, or visit airlinevideos.com. On behalf of the entire crew, thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again on the next Plane Jockeys podcast.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.